Friends, hello. It's me again, your guide to the world of history, where we don't just flip through dry facts, but live every moment. Let's make a deal before we dive into this abyss. If you enjoy what I've put together here, if you get goosebumps or, on the contrary, feel the urge to argue until you're hoarse, don't give it a thumbs down. Instead, hit that bell and write a comment. I assure you, reading your opinions is a special kind of pleasure and fuel for new investigations. Let's go. The T-34 under His Majesty's microscope. Shame or triumph? How the British wept with envy while studying our 34. Lately, I've been finding it physically impossible to scroll through my feed calmly, because every other expert, who apparently learned about tank building from video games, considers it their sacred duty to spit on everything made by the hands of our grandfathers. The legendary T-34 gets especially lucky. You read the comments and you're just amazed. They say it wasn't a tank, but a barn on tracks. The armor was flimsy, the transmission was pathetic, the welds were crooked. They claim we overwhelmed the Germans not with skill, but with sheer manpower and the fact that the Fritz simply ran out of shells by 43. And our 34s only made it to Berlin because American Shermans towed them there. Listen, this isn't even funny anymore. It's a diagnosis. Whenever I hear such nonsense, I always ask one simple question. Why then did the British themselves, who in 43 got their hands on a live, fresh T-34 straight from a Soviet factory, not spit on it, but instead wrote reports that still make many critics blush? Today, I want us to forget for an hour about our personal sympathies and antipathies. Let's look at the 34, not through the eyes of a patriot in love with the USSR, nor through the gaze of a rabid westernizer. Let's look at it through the eyes of the world's most fastidious gentleman, a British military engineer from the Tank Technology School at Chertsey. Trust me, this will be a detective story cooler than any Netflix series. Chapter 1. How a secret Russian came to visit the British Lion. Let's clear the air right away. You often hear a conspiracy theory. They sent a specially hyped, polished to a shine, custom-made model to the British, so the Allies wouldn't guess that the tanks were actually made from scrap metal on someone's knee. Guys, forget this myth. It's complete nonsense, and I'll explain why right now. In the spring of 1943, the world situation was shaky. The British had already taken a beating in Africa, the Normandy landings were still just a plan, and they needed new weapons samples like air. They weren't asking Stalin for souvenirs for a museum. The British military mission submitted a harsh utilitarian order: give us anti-tank rifles, anti-aircraft fire control systems, artillery systems, and, of course, tanks, T-34s, and heavy KVs. And you know what's telling? The Soviet Union could have refused, cited wartime difficulties, asked for something in return via Lend-Lease. But no, the request was met almost 100%. On the 13th of June, 43, in the port of Arkhangelsk, the 34s were loaded onto the ship Empire Porpoise. Along with them went crates of spare parts, oil, gun grease, and ammunition, 19 armor-piercing shells, 53 high-explosive fragmentation shells, and even 5 shrapnel shells, which the British mistakenly called armor-piercing shot in the documents. The tanks didn't arrive in perfect condition. The acceptance reports aren't fairy tales. Some vehicles were missing machine gun magazines, the tarpaulins were old and torn. No one polished them to a mirror shine. This was an ordinary workhorse frontline machine, the kind that plowed through the fields near Moscow and Stalingrad by the thousands. And so, on the 22nd of November, 1943, this tank entered the grounds of the Tank Technology School at Chertsey. For it, this was probably the scariest exam of its life. Chapter 2. First impression. My God! How crude, but how brilliant! Imagine a British engineer. He's used to order, to perfectly fitted clearances, to chrome-plated bolts. He works in a workshop full of high-precision machine tools. And then, in front of him stands a T-34. The welds, in places, look like they were done by yesterday's vocational school student. The cast parts of the turret show signs of rough machining. The prism holders in the sights are hand-soldered by some Uncle Vajia, who probably only had 2 grades of education. For a Brit, this is culture shock. But only until the moment they started digging deeper. And that's when things get really interesting. I'll quote an excerpt from their own report, which is still preserved in the archives. Subsequent developments in Russia and Great Britain have not run on parallel lines. The Russians have aimed at mechanical simplicity, a powerful all-purpose gun, strong armor, and, above all, a design facilitating quantity production with limited resources and in the absence of special machine tools and skilled labor. Do you feel that moment? They weren't judging. They understood. Moreover, they admired this approach. The British saw what modern armchair warriors don't see. They saw a philosophy, the philosophy of total war. We often criticize Soviet industry. Oh, the Germans made tigers, like Swiss watches with cemented armor with Zeiss optics. Yes, they did. One tiger cost as much as 4, maybe 5 T-34s. The German economy, even using the resources of all of Europe, physically could not produce tigers in the thousands. But the Soviet Union needed a tank that could be built in a freezing workshop in the Urals, where machine tools evacuated from Kharkov had been set up. A tank that could be driven into battle by a former tractor driver, not a hereditary nobleman with an engineering degree. And here, the British make a shocking statement. They write, "The designers have shown considerable boldness in adopting manufacturing expedients not usual in current British practice." Not usual in current practice. That's an understatement. If a British general had seen that the new tank's hull was welded from sheets of only 3 standard sizes, 15, 20, and 45 millimeters, he would have fainted. For the British, this was barbaric. For us, it was salvation. Chapter 3. The V2 diesel. Aluminum hunger and boldness bordering on madness. Now let's talk about the heart. The engine. The British were astonished. They wrote, the 12-cylinder compression ignition engine with direct injection is based on an aero engine design. The weight of all components is low. The main castings are in light alloy. Light alloy. Aluminum. Do you understand what this means? In a country where every kilogram of aluminum was worth its weight in gold, where this metal was used for aircraft wings, Soviet engineers put a huge aluminum tub, the engine block, into a tank. This was either madness or genius, or rather an act of desperation elevated to an absolute. The Germans hesitated for a long time to put diesels in their tanks. The British also used gasoline engines. But we went all in. And we won. The V2 diesel was more economical, less fire-prone than gasoline. Diesel ignites less easily. And this aluminum block allowed the engine to remain light, not overloading the running gear. The British noted that the starter on the Soviet tank worked at any angle of inclination, unlike their own finicky systems. They were amazed that our mechanics could start the engine in 40-degree frost using compressed air. They, by the way, immediately noticed the oddity. The tank lacked series-produced preheating equipment for extreme cold conditions. This looked like a flaw. But apparently, our designers considered the compressed air starting system and the tanker's habit of warming the crankcase with a blowtorch a sufficient substitute for the Germans' finicky systems. Pragmatism. Chapter 4. The Christie suspension and the splash problem. Now, the running gear. The British generally considered themselves trendsetters in tank building. And here they see a suspension developed by the American Christie back in the interwar period. But Soviet engineers didn't just copy it. They perfected what Christie himself couldn't sell to his own army. The British report dryly states, "The suspension follows very closely the original Christie design, but the springs are protected by the main armor. The spaces between the spring housings are occupied by fuel tanks." That's brilliant. Look, on most tanks, fuel tanks are iron suitcases hanging somewhere in the engine compartment or even in the fighting compartment, like on the Shermans, which earned them the nickname Ronson-lighters. Here, the fuel is in niches protected by the road wheels and the armored hull. Space saving plus additional protection. But there were criticisms, too. The British were puzzled by the phrase regarding insufficient splash protection. This has a double meaning. On one hand, it's simple waterproofing. When fording rivers or even during heavy rain, water would leak inside the tank. This annoyed the British. They were used to the inside of a tank being dry. But there's a second side. The report hints at scale inside the hull. During the war, the quality of internal armor finishing was often neglected. The scale wasn't removed, and if a shell hit the armor but didn't penetrate, a red-hot piece of metal, that same scale or splash, could spall off the inside, flying around the turret and killing the crew as effectively as the shell itself. The problem was known. As early as 42, meetings were held shouting that armor needed to be thoroughly cleaned. But when every minute counts and the front is waiting for every tank, alas, cleanliness was a secondary concern. And yet, the British honestly admit, neither fighting nor performance characteristics suffer from this crude finish. Chapter 5. Was it really blind? Optics and build quality. Another favorite myth of the debunkers. The T-34 was a blind mole. The view was terrible, the sights were poor, the commander also worked as the loader, couldn't see a thing. Yes, visibility issues existed. The two-man turret was the Achilles heel of the early 34s. The commander indeed often doubled as the loader because there was no fourth crew member in the turret. That's a fact. And the British noted this. Crew space appears somewhat restricted, which impairs the efficient servicing of the weapon. But let's not confuse cramped space with quality. The British engineers, men with magnifying glasses and micrometers, examined the Soviet periscopic sight. And guess what they wrote? Where high standards for efficient functioning are required, e.g., in the periscope sight and fuel pump, a high standard of manufacture is attained. So they clearly distinguished, crooked handles inside the cabin is one thing, but the sight, on which hitting the enemy depends, is something else entirely. By the way, the Americans at the Aberdeen Proving Ground also studied the T-34 and rendered their verdict. The sighting device for the 76mm gun was the best in the world for reliability. So the myth of the blind tank shatters against the dry figures of Allied reports. They had no reason to praise obvious rubbish. Chapter 6. Inspection stamps and manual labor. I'm always amused when someone talks about the low build quality of Soviet tanks. I don't deny it. There were factory defects. It was war. At plant number 183 in Nizhny Tagil, up to 20% of the workers were teenagers who could barely reach the machine tools. But let's look back at that British report. There's a very interesting detail. British specialists noted a large number of inspection stamps. What does this mean? It means that despite the external ugliness of the welds, despite the fact that a nut might be welded on crookedly, the quality control system worked rigorously. Every component, every critical part underwent inspection. And if it passed, a stamp was applied, serviceable. Yes, maybe that stamp was applied by yesterday's schoolgirl, her hands covered in oil, who would have to go under bombing again tomorrow. But she applied it honestly. The British admitted, yes, their factories were neater and tidier. But they also honestly wrote, automatic methods would probably have resulted in a better appearance and greater accuracy of manufacture. But with hand methods, the labor employed was of low grade, and this was economically justified under existing conditions. So they understood the main point. The USSR wasn't building a tank for a weapons exhibition, but for a lethal assembly line. And this line had to work even when the workshop was partly bombed out and the machines stood in the open air. Chapter 7. Why did the Germans lose the factory battle? An economic pause. Let's step away from the metal for a second and look at the numbers. Because this is where the real truth is buried. By the end of the war, Germany and the USSR had produced tanks and self-propelled guns. 102,000 on our side versus 46,000 on theirs. Now let's compare the price tag. The German Tiger, a technological masterpiece. It cost insane money, required skilled workers, and scarce alloying metals. Only 1,354 were made. The T-34, depending on the year of production, cost from 269,000 rubles at the beginning of the war to 135,000 rubles in 45. For the same cost as one Tiger, the Soviet Union could make 4 or 5 34s. Think about those numbers. One Tiger takes a position, burns 3 of our tanks from a distance of 1.5 kilometers. But, while its crew celebrates victory, 10 more T-34s emerge from behind the forest. They surround the heavy cat, hit it from the sides, and that's the end of the Tiger. The Germans simply couldn't replace their losses fast enough. The American Sherman was a good tank, no argument. But it wasn't perfect either. It had issues with fire safety and cross-country mobility. The British, comparing their Crusaders and Churchills with the T-34, realized that their cruiser tanks were delicate orchids, while the Russian tank was a soldier tank. You wouldn't hesitate to throw it into mud, forest, swamp. It just needed to get there, fire, and, if lucky, come back. Chapter 8. Legacy. What happened to the T-34 after the war, and what does Israel have to do with it? The funniest part is that the debate over who was best still rages. Some experts say the Sherman was no worse. And indeed, in Korea they met in direct combat, a draw. But here's the thing. The German PZ.4 exhausted its modernization potential by the middle of the war. The Sherman was modernized. The Israelis even put 105mm guns on it, but these were already Frankentanks. The T-34, however, gave rise to an entire dynasty. The T-44, which arrived too late for the war. The T-54, which became the best tank of the 50s. The T-62, which fought in Africa and the Middle East. All of them carried the genetic code of the 34. Even modern Russian tanks, if you look closely, are an evolution of that very boldness the British noticed in 43. Moreover, the T-34 Tank Museum itself tells an amazing story. Dozens of 34s, standing on pedestals across the country, are still operational. Machinery that has stood under rain and snow for half a century starts up and drives. What German Tiger or American Sherman is capable of that without a complete factory overhaul? None. Chapter 9. And what about the British themselves? Did they cry or envy? When you read these reports, you catch yourself thinking that the British officers experienced a slight disappointment in themselves. Here they are, the mighty of the world, rulers of the seas, the men who invented the tank. And then comes a barbarian from the east and builds a machine that, in key parameters, surpasses their cruiser tanks in survivability and simplicity. They don't write this openly, but it's felt between the lines. They try to find excuses. Our machine tools are better. Our workers are more skilled. We could have made the same one, but prettier. But the fact remains. They asked to be sent a T-34 for study. We didn't ask them for tanks. They asked us. If the T-34 had been outright junk, do you really think Churchill, who personally oversaw military matters, would have publicly told journalists, "The Russian tank T-34 is one of the 3 best weapons of the war, and I do not understand how the Russians managed to create it? I do not understand how. That's pure Winston." He acknowledged genius even when that genius was ideologically alien to him. Conclusion. I don't believe these gentlemen. Or do I? So what's the result? It's fashionable now to deconstruct everything. To find a black cat in a dark room. To prove that our grandfathers were fools and victory was an accident. It's easy to sit in a cozy armchair, sip latte, and debate how hatches in the turret should have been made when bullets aren't whistling over your head. The British in 43 couldn't afford subjectivity. They didn't need propaganda. They needed the truth to survive and win. And their truth was harsh. Yes, the T-34 isn't perfect. Yes, it's cramped and noisy. Yes, the gearbox on early models was hell for the driver mechanic. Yes, it was raw. But it works. Kills the enemy. It reaches Berlin. The Americans at their Aberdeen tests blew the engine after 343 kilometers. Dust, poor air filter, a cyclone that was practically a dummy. Disaster. Shame. Shout the experts now. But they forget to clarify. The same poor tank covered thousands of kilometers over Russian off-road terrain. The Americans were just used to clean air and changing air filters after every march. With us, the filter's lifespan was until the first swamp. Drove through mud, the filter self-cleaned with water. Again, pragmatism. I'm not calling for the T-34 to be canonized. I'm calling for respect. Respect for the engineers who refined the design under bombing. Respect for the young workers who stood at machines for 12 hours. Respect for the driver mechanics who squeezed every last drop out of this machine, and then some. We do not apologize for the T-34. We shouldn't have to justify ourselves to those who say it was bad. It wasn't bad. It was necessary. And the British, upon receiving it, didn't spit. They learned. They looked with envious eyes at the wide tracks, the diesel, the rational sloping armor angles. These grown men in uniform had to admit, yes, there is something to learn from these Russians. Final chord. Your move, reader. I didn't write this to convince anyone. The historian's debate will never end. I wrote this so that you and I remember one simple thing. The T-34 isn't just a piece of armor. It's the formula of victory frozen in metal. It's a formula where simplicity doesn't mean weakness, where crudeness doesn't mean unreliability, and where cost doesn't equal quality. It's the formula of must be done, so it shall be done. Friends, if you've read this far, it means our history isn't indifferent to you. I spent a huge amount of time digging through these archival documents, translating dry phrases from English, and turning them into a living narrative. So I have a huge, simply gigantic request for you. Subscribe to the channel. Click that stupid little bell so you don't miss new investigations. On my list, analyzing how the Americans copied our submachine guns and why the Germans still fear our Urals. And write a comment. Don't be lazy. What does the T-34 mean to you? Just a museum exhibit or a living legend? Maybe your grandfather fought in a 34? Or maybe you restored one yourself at a Patriot Club. Every opinion matters to me. I read everything, even criticism, even the nasty stuff, even the comments cursing me for Soviet propaganda. Let's have a real brainstorming session here. Don't let history turn into a flat comic book. The T-34 lives as long as we remember it, and as long as people like us are willing to argue until we're hoarse, defending the truth. Thank you for being with me. See you on the air.